So we're up to Acts chapter 19, verse 30 to Acts 20, verse 12. Last week we had Paul. He's at Ephesus preaching in the synagogue. He was there for 3 months. That's his longest stint in any synagogue. But as usual, he gets a bit of opposition from them. And so he has to take the disciples, the new converts, out of the synagogue, and he moves to a place called the School of Tyrannus. It's just a building, and where he taught for 2 years in Ephesus. Again, we see with Paul, there's authenticating signs following him, things like his handkerchiefs or his work aprons, with his sweaty stuff on them, were taken to people and they were healed. And also, we see him casting out demons and things like that. Now, we met up with 7 sons of Sceva last week, and they tried to imitate Paul by using the name of Jesus. They thought it was like an incantation that they'd used. But the only thing is they got badly beaten up by the man possessed by some demons. And so that didn't work for them. The result of this was that many who had believed in Jesus, they now brought all their books of magic arts, and they burnt them, they destroyed them. And they renounced all their ties with the occult. So it certainly was caused a cleaning up of the believers down there in Ephesus. Again, Paul caused a stir. He caused a stir wherever he goes. He caused a stir this time over Artemis. That's the god of the Ephesians down there. And there's one silversmith called Demetrius. He was a bit upset, because he was the guy who, and other artisans like himself, were making shrines for Diana, silver shrines. And the problem was, with so many people who were turning away from idolatry to Jesus, business is being affected. So their financial wealth is now being affected by the preaching of Paul, and it's bad for business. So Demetrius, he stirs up a mob, and they drag 2 of Paul's companions, a guy called Gaius and another one, Aristarchus, and they drag him down into the theater, which is pretty much where we are today. We're up to where we are today, verse 30. All right, so in verses 30 to 31, we're now told of Paul's response to this outbreak and the dissuasion of Paul. In verse 30, and when Paul was minded to enter in unto the people, and the disciples suffered him, they suffered him not. And certain also of the Asiarchs, being his friends, sent unto him and besought him not to adventure himself into the theatre. So we see Paul wants to go down into the theatre now to go and, have a discussion with this mob down there. He clearly wanted to face this howling mob, even though he knew that this could mean certain death. And this could be the background. What we see here could be the background to the statements that he made in 2 Corinthians 1, verses 8 to 9, where he says, yes, we ourselves have had the sentence of death upon ourselves. So, this could have been quite possibly what he was thinking about when he wrote 2 Corinthians. And he also mentions here the afflictions that befell them in Asia. So he wants to go into this mob to go and debate with them, but we have the dissuasion by 2 groups of people. First of all, the disciples suffered him not. So he's being dissuaded by his own disciples. And the Greek is fantastic, isn't it? The way it's written in Greek, it denotes resistance to pressure. So the more Paul insisted upon going, the more the disciples refused to allow it. So it's a real battle between these 2 groups. And the mere fact that the disciples won over, probably saved Paul's life. However, in verse 31, he's now dissuaded by the Asiarchs from going in, and certain also of the Asiarchs. Now, this is another example here of Luke's historical accuracy, because this was the proper title for the official leaders of this area. Who were the Asiarchs? The Asiarchs were 10 officials or officers elected by the cities and the province. And what we had here was each province had Asiarchs. They had two key responsibilities. First of all, they were to supervise the funds, the money, collected in the worship of the emperor. And second, they were to preside at games and festivals. And these games and festivals occurred only at their own expense. So that's what these guys would do. Only the wealthy could actually accept the job of an Asiarch. The wealthy eagerly sought this office, even though it would cost them money, because it gave them, a great amount of prestige. Look at me, look at me. Now, we're told that some of these Asiarchs, at least, had actually become friends of Paul. They're friends of Paul, but they came to respect Paul for who he was. But it doesn't mean that they were actually believers in Jesus. But at least they had respect for Paul. And so these guys sent him a message. They were not present to restrain Paul physically from going into the theater. Fortunately, that was being done by his disciples. So they sent him a message beseeching him not to enter the theater. Because remember that down in that theater, that theater can hold about 25,000 people. Down in that theater, there's a howling mob there. And so these messengers were sent by the Asiarchs, and they had to insist to Paul. They had to insist over Paul's protest, do not go in there. It could cost you your life. Now, all this mob down in the theater, verse 32 tells us that some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. So what we have down there in this theater is that there's this massive state of confusion down there. And the cause of the confusion was that some were crying one thing and some were crying something else. And virtually, they kept crying one thing and then another. That's what the Greek says. They just kept crying this and kept crying that. And the reason was that the entire assembly was in confusion. And here we have the word for assembly, the Greek word for assembly, ecclesia. Ecclesia. Normally, we talk about the church being the ecclesia. But this shows here that the word ecclesia, when used in its classical Greek pagan sense, and that's what it's being used here, and it's not the body of Christ in every case. So sometimes we see ecclesia being used as a pagan group, a pagan gathering. So this was a pagan assembly, but it was being called an ecclesia because that's how the Greek word was used in secular literature anyway. So this was a pagan assembly, but it was not a legal one, as we're going to learn as we learn from verse 39. The true state of affairs here was that most of the people who were down there in this confusing state didn't know why they'd come together. They were just mob rule, mate. They just all went together. There's something happening in the theater, let's go. So it's a mob situation, and it was not an orderly assembly at all, because most of the people didn't know the issues and why they'd come running into the theater. They just say, hang on, something's going on. We need to be there. They want to miss out. Fear of missing out. FOMO. And in verses 33 to 34, we now read about Alexander and the mob. And they brought Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander beckoned with the hand and would have made a defense unto the people. But when they perceived that he was a Jew, all with one voice at the space of 2 hours cried out, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. So what we see here in verse 33, we see this man Alexander. He now turns up. The Jews, and these are the believing Jews, the Jews feared that the mob would turn upon them as well, because it was general knowledge that the Jews did not practice idolatry, and this is all about their idol worship. Their great is Diana, So the Jews were a bit frightened now that they're going to turn upon them. So what did they do? Because, well, first of all, everybody knew that they were opposed to idolatry. Also, many of the Christian leaders themselves were Jews, including Paul, Gaius, and Aristarchus. So, for fear of the mob turning upon the Jewish people down there, Alexander was now chosen by the unbelieving Jews to attempt to quiet the mob and to explain to them the viewpoint of the Jewish community who did not believe in Jesus. So we need to separate ourselves from these people of the way. Those guys believe in Jesus, but not us. We're here. We're peaceful. We're not preaching against Diana. And the Greek word here for putting forward means to push forward. Alexander, you're the man. Go talk to the crowd. In actual fact, this quite possibly could have been the same Alexander, the coppersmith, who did much harm, according to 2 Timothy 4:14. He did much harm to Paul, because this Alexander here was also from Ephesus. However, Alexander beckoned with the hand. He's trying to shake the, come on, crowd, quieten down. He's trying to rapidly wave the hand to get a hearing. And he wanted to make a defense unto the people. So he wanted to make this defense. He tried to make a defense, but never really got the chance. The Greek word apologia for defense means he wanted to make a formal apology, a formal defense, but he had no chance, not with mob rule like that. And in verse 34, we now have the response of the mob. But when they perceived that he was a Jew, so this mob obviously had anti-Semitic feelings. Remember, the mob had no comprehension of any differences between Jews and Christians. As far as the mob was concerned, all the Christians were also Jews. At least for all the leaders of the Christians, that was true. But the mob couldn't tell the difference. They just figured, you're all tarred with the same brush. So all with one voice, the mob, all with one voice about the space of 2 hours. 2 hours, kept crying out. They cried out for 2 hours. One voice arose from all crying. That's what the Greek says. And the crowd became unanimous, and the confusion subsided. Probably get tired after 2 hours of yelling out, "Great is Diana." And this was done now at the sight of the hated Jew Alexander. And the cry is, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." This is the way it began back in verse 28. They kept on crying, and they cried for 2 solid hours. Man, you get a sore throat after that. Verses 35 to 41, we now meet the town clerk. We have him, and when the town clerk had quieted the multitude, what's the town clerk? It's a word. He is a grammateus. That's who he is in Greek. Greek title is a grammateus, and in actual fact, archaeological inscriptions, which were found in Ephesus, call him that, grammateus. Again, we're looking at Luke's historical accuracy here. So who is he? This man was the most important chief executive in the city government. So he was the administrative official in the city. He was the guy who kept the archives. He kept the money. He presided over its assembly. He's the guy who drafted decrees to be submitted to the meeting of the public assembly. So he acted as chairman of the public assembly. So he's pretty, he's the hobnob. He's the big guy. He communicated directly also with the proconsul. So he's the one now who steps forward and he quietens the crowd down because they recognize him because, he's the guy who's in charge. His presence actually commanded respect here. So he's quieting them down. And now we have his speech to the mob. He spells out the status of Artemis. And the addressee is, "Ye men of Ephesus." He said, "What man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple keeper of the great Diana, or the great Artemis?" Remember, Ephesus was known as the temple keeper. and archaeological inscriptions describes Ephesus exactly as Luke would describe the city. And this again, Luke's historical accuracy. In fact, there was a coin found from the year AD 65. It describes Ephesus as a temple keeper. This would be the temple of Artemis. Ephesus was the temple keeper of Artemis and of the image which fell down from Jupiter. That's what the town clerk is talking about. And he uses the Greek name for Jupiter, which was Zeus. The Ephesians believe that the image of Artemis, which was in the temple, came down from heaven. Some actually believe that what really happened was that a meteorite fell down to the earth, and from this meteorite, the image of Artemis was formed. However, that there's no actual documentation to do that. That's probably pure speculation. Now, in verse 36, he reminds them of what the mob's response should be. He says, seeing then that these things cannot be gainsaid. What does that mean? The Greek for gainsaid means these things are undeniable. These things are undeniable. What things? The fact that Ephesus is the temple keeper and that Diana is the greatest of all. Now, so these legends he mentioned were considered as being absolutely true. And the mob must be two things. They need to be quiet. They need to quieten down and stop shouting, and they must do nothing rash. The Greek word for rash here means to fall forward or to fall headlong. In other words, don't rush headlong into anything. Just calm down. Calm down. Try and calm this crowd down. And in verse 37, he talks now about Gaius and Aristarchus, who were captured by the mob. And he says, for you have brought hither these men. And this is Gaius and Aristarchus. And these men were not guilty of two charges. First of all, they were not guilty of robbing temples. And this was actually mentioned in Romans chapter 2, verse 22. And second, they were not blasphemers of our goddess. So even though Paul and the boys, the disciples, preached against idolatry, they used tact so as to not commit any illegalities. They preached within the guidelines, if you like. And so what the town clerk is saying, he says, listen, these two men, they're not guilty of any of these two crimes because they're working within the guidelines. And then in verses 38 and 39, he now spells out to them the proper course of action that they should take. First, the proper course of action for Demetrius was given in verse 38. And the town clerk says, if therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen that are with him, the town clerk here, he knew who was responsible for the riot. If they have a case against anyone, or if they desire to sue anybody, the courts are open. So it's not a mob rule thing. Go to the courts. This is a reference here to the regular court days which were in session. That's the proper place to bring up these charges. And there were also proconsuls. Remember, Asia was a Roman senatorial province and was therefore under a proconsul. And the proconsul was the proper judge before whom they could accuse one another. In other words, what he's doing is he's telling the mob, he says, listen, Demetrius, you and the other artisans, if you get a problem, use the proper legal procedures and do not begin mob violence. And second, he tells the mob their proper course of action in verse 39. He says, if you seek anything about other matters, so if they seek resolutions on other matters rather than personal grievances or criminal issues, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. Literally, it means that it should be settled in the legal assembly. And again, here we have the assembly being the ecclesia. So it's a pagan meeting, the word ecclesia is used for. And what he's saying to the mob is, he says, listen, guys, this here, what you're doing now is clearly an illegal meeting. You cannot do this. Issues are to be settled in the legal assembly, and this was not a legal public assembly. We don't settle things by mob rule here, he's saying. And in verse 40, he warns them of the danger. For indeed, we are in danger to be accused concerning this day's riot. And the Greek word for danger here means peril. And you see it used twice. It's used here, used here, and in Luke 8:23 and 1 Corinthians 15:13. The point here is that the Romans could accuse the Ephesians of an insurrection because, why? Because there was no good reason for this mob action, which has just taken place. And if the Romans find out about this, it could cause a problem for the Ephesians. Chan Clark goes on to say, he says, listen, there being no cause for this mob riot, as touching it, we shall not be able to give account of this concourse. In other words, if the proconsul asks the reason for the riots, they'll have no good explanation to give him. The Roman writer Seneca, he wrote that there is nothing that the Romans looked on with such suspicion as a riotous meeting. Because wherever there was a riotous meeting, the Romans were always suspicious of these because they might be an insurrection against Rome. And they did not like that. They didn't take kindly to that. So the town clerk is warning him, let's disperse from here because we have no reason for this mob violence at the moment. Let's stop it. So in verse 41, we have the dismissal of the assembly. When he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly. So this gave it a degree of semblance and a degree of order by formally dismissing the assembly. This is the ecclesia again. And so by him taking charge here, this might actually provide some protection from any charge coming from the proconsul, because he said, yes, I just dismissed the assembly. It was a legal assembly, I dismissed it. Okay, so that now ended Paul's work in Ephesus. Now, a couple of things here. Some lessons to be learned from the events of Ephesus. And we learned 3 lessons. First of all, the gospel is preached, for you and I, the gospel is preached to a hostile world, both Jew and Gentile. Often we see the Jewish opposition is stressed in the book of Acts, but what we're seeing here in this instance is this was clearly a Gentile opposition. So the gospel is proclaimed to a hostile world, both Jew and Gentile. Second lesson, the opposition to the gospel will intensify if vested interests, especially economic interests, are challenged, right? Nobody touched my money. Third lesson, opposition is no excuse for failure. It's no excuse for failure to preach the gospel. We must preach the gospel in spite of opposition. We cannot stop preaching the gospel. Okay. Second thing before we leave here is to summarize Paul's ministry in Ephesus. We look at it in 10 points. First of all, what we saw here was that this is the longest single ministry that Paul had as far as we know. And this comes out in Acts chapter 19, verse 8, 10, 22, and 20, verse 31. Secondly, it included evangelizes the disciples of John the Baptist. Remember, we saw them back last week, John the Baptist's disciples, back in Acts chapter 19, verse 1 to 7. Third, Much of his ministry was in a teaching hall in the school of Tyrannus, and we see this in Acts chapter 19. Remember, Paul was in Ephesus for over 2 years, about 2 years, 3 months he was down there for. Fourth, his ministry was accompanied with unusual miracles, and again we see them in Acts chapter 19, verses 11 to 12. Fifth, the power of the occult, power of the occultism among the believers was finally broken in Acts 19, verse 9. Remember, when they saw what happened in the sons of Sceva, they then brought all their occultic books, burned them all. Sixth, what we saw here was that Paul in Ephesus saw an enlarged ministry in the future. And this is in Acts 19:21. Seventh, his ministry finally ended here with a riot in Acts 19:23 to 41. And eighth, Paul's ministry in Ephesus was also characterized by pastoral care, according to, we'll see next week, according to Acts chapter 20, verse 20 and verse 31. And it was probably here where he wrote 1 Corinthians as well. In Romans 16, verses 3 to 4, it records that Priscilla and Aquila actually risked their lives to save Paul in Ephesus. And in 1 Corinthians 15:32, it mentions that he had to fight with wild beasts. It wasn't actually wild animals, but the mob down there acted like wild beasts. And this was probably a reference to the events of this riot that we just saw. Remember, the Asiarchs and his disciples says, mate, don't you dare go into that crowd because they will kill you. And in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 9, he had a lot of adversaries. Paul faced constant dangers. In 2 Corinthians 1, 8 to 10, we're told in verse 8 that afflictions befell Paul in Asia. He despaired even of life. So even Paul was despairing. And verse 9 of 2 Corinthians 1 says that they had the sentence of death within themselves. And verse 10 says that the Lord delivered them out of so great a death. So not only was Paul despairing, not only did they have the sentence of death, but the Lord delivered them all out of so great a death. Okay, we're going to go into Macedonia and Greece. So we've left Asia, which is the western part of modern day Turkey today. We've left there. We're now going across into Macedonia and Greece, into the European side. And this is chapter 20, verses 1 to 4. And after the uproar ceased, after the riots finished, Paul, having sent for the disciples and exhorted them, took leave of them and departed to go into Macedonia. When he had gone through those parts and had given them much exhortation, he came into Greece. When he had spent 3 months there, and a plot was laid against him by Jews as he was about to set sail for Syria, he determined to return through Macedonia. And there accompanied him as far as Asia, Sopater of Berea, the son of Pyrrhus, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus. So he has a couple of guys following him now. So we have the ministry in Macedonia and Greece in these 4 verses. And verse 1 describes his departure for Macedonia. The timing was, after the uproar of chapter 19, after the riot down there in Ephesus ceased. It was after the ceasing of the riot. So what we see here, that riot was the catalyst for Paul's departure from Ephesus. He probably figured, he said, I've done my time here now. I think it's time to leave. But before leaving, he calls out his disciples down there, because remember, many came to faith in the synagogue down there, and also he spent 2 years teaching in the hall of Tyrannus. So he now sends for the disciples, and he informs them of his plan to leave Ephesus, and he exhorted them. He said, listen, guys, he said, look, just stand fast in the faith. Stand fast in the faith. Don't backslide. Stand fast in the faith, even though you're going to have opposition here. And then he took leave of them. And the Greek word here means that to draw to oneself in embrace, so he embraced them all, in a greeting. It was a very warm departure, is what I'm trying to say. It was a warm departure, friendly departure. And now he departed from them to go across the Aegean Sea into Macedonia. He doesn't specify, but it could be here that what he was heading for was the town of Philippi, which was in Macedonia. We don't know. Now, 2 Corinthians was not written while he was in Ephesus. Then at the very latest time, it was written at this point. Evidence that it was written at this point comes out in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 12 to 13, and 2 Corinthians chapter 7, 5 to 17. So he's now going to head across the sea, across to Macedonia. And verse 2 arrives at the arrival into Greece. And this was pretty much a summary of his ministry in Macedonia. Virtually it says when he had gone through those parts, and that's of Macedonia, he had given them much exhortation. So he now comes to Greece. So he travels through, encouraging the brothers. This was more a discipleship ministry rather than an evangelistic one, because he's not spending much time. He's just encouraging the brethren there. And it says he went as far as Illyricum, we know, which is today, well, it's the former Yugoslavia. That's where it is. Illyricum. We know that from Romans 15, verse 19. So this summarizes about a year of his ministry down here. Other things we know during this period of ministry, we see in verse 2, we can get this from 2 Corinthians. What we do know from 2 Corinthians is he had a ministry in Troas, and that's 2 Corinthians 2, 12 to 13. He met with Titus, and we see that in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 13 to chapter 7, verse 16. And, this is when he wrote 2 Corinthians. And finally, Paul now comes to Greece, and specifically he comes to the city of Corinth. Remember, he's been there before. And in verse 3 is his departure from Greece. And the timing was when he had spent about 3 months in Corinth. So he spends 3 months down there in Corinth. He actually spent the winter months of AD, either 56, 57 or 57, 58. So he spent the winter in Corinth. And it could be that during this time in Corinth, he wrote the epistle to the Galatians. But for certain, we know that during this time while in Corinth, he wrote the book of Romans. So this is where he wrote it. And this was on his third missionary journey where he writes this epistle to the Romans. Now, at this point, Paul now becomes aware of another conspiracy against him. Poor guy, he's just not liked, is he? Now, a plot was laid against him by the Jews as he was about to sail to Syria. So his original plan, he was going to sail from Corinth right back down to Israel. Israel was in the province of Syria. Why? Because he wanted to get to Jerusalem for the Passover, but now that he finds out that there's a plot to assassinate him, he has to change plans. They're going to either assassinate him either at the port or while he was on the voyage. So he now changes his plans, and he heads a different way. Therefore, because of that plot, and because he was aware of the plot, he determined now to return by way of Macedonia. So he's going to go from Corinth down the bottom, he's going to go up the coast to Macedonia. and then he's going to go an overland route rather than a sea route. And that would mean he'd not make it to Jerusalem in time for Passover. And so he spends the Passover in the city of Philippi. Now, if you were a practicing Jew, this is one of the feasts where you had to be in Jerusalem. But because Paul is no longer under Mosaic law, he doesn't have to be in Jerusalem. So he spends Passover in Philippi. This is allowed under grace. Mosaic law is Paul can follow some parts of Mosaic law by choice, voluntarily. He's no longer forced to follow it. So in verse 4, we see those guys who accompany Paul as far as Asia. Remember, when we speak of Asia, it's just across the water into the western side of Turkey. So Paul was accompanied specifically by church representatives. First of all, we had Sopater, the son of Pyrrhus. He represents the church in Berea. And then we have two representatives from the church of Thessalonica, were Aristarchus and Secundus. We see Aristarchus mentioned elsewhere in Acts 19:29 and Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. And also Philemon. We see him in Philemon 24. Secundus, we don't see him mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. So the church of Berea and the church of Thessalonica were both Macedonian churches. And from the church of Derbe came Gaius. From the church of Lystra came Timothy. These were the churches down in the Galatian regions. These representing the Asian churches were also Tychicus and Trophimus. So they're the Asian churches. Asian churches were like Ephesus. And Trophimus is mentioned once elsewhere, and we see Trophimus mentioned in 2 Timothy 4, verse 20. So these guys are involved in the full-time ministry. Okay, another person who accompanied them was Luke. How do we know? Because it can be seen from the use of the plural pronoun we in following verses. Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. We don't see here any representatives mentioned from the church of Philippi. In all likelihood, though, it was Luke who was with the group who accompanied Paul at this time. He was probably the guy, the man who represented the church of Philippi. Because remember, back in chapter 16, Luke had been left behind to pastor the church of Philippi. We saw that. So when Paul and Silas, those guys left, Luke was left behind in Philippi to pastor the church. Achaia was probably represented by Paul himself, and that's where the church of Corinth was, down in Achaia. And Paul probably represented the church from there. So we have a representative from most of the churches not only in the Macedonian region, but in the Asian region, and we had some from the Galatian region. And so these guys are all representing their churches, and they're all heading down to Jerusalem. These followed Paul as far as Asia, and the Greek reads that Sopater followed him only as far as Asia and then left the party for reasons that we don't know. And some of the others went much further with Paul. For instance, we see Trophimus in Acts 21:29. He goes all the way into Jerusalem. Aristarchus followed Paul as far as Rome. And we see this. We're going to see this in Acts 27, verse 2. And also you can read about it in Colossians 4, verse 10. So these men were to escort Paul at least as far as Jerusalem. And why were they doing this? Because these guys were representing their churches with donations to the church of Jerusalem. They were bringing financial assistance to the church of Jerusalem. Now we come to Troas. Troas, we see this in chapter 20, verses 5 to 12. But these had gone before and were waiting for us at Troas. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where we tarried 7 days. And upon the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul discoursed with them, intending to depart on the morrow, and prolonged his speech until midnight. And there sat in the window a certain young man named Eutychus, borne down with deep sleep. And as Paul discoursed yet longer, being borne down by his sleep, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. And Paul went down and fell on him, and embracing him said, Make ye no ado, for his life is in him. And when he was gone up, and had broken the bread and eaten, and had talked with them a long while, even till break of day, so he departed. And they brought the lad alive, and were not a little comforted. So, Paul's left Philippi, he's gone across the water into Troas, and it says these had gone before. Who'd gone before? The other guys mentioned in verse 4 sailed ahead of Paul into Asia Minor, except for Luke. Luke stayed behind with Paul. So the others were waiting for Paul and Luke in Troas. Notice the first person us is used again here. So we see Luke now rejoin the group at Philippi. He didn't sail ahead with the others. He chose to remain with Paul, and Luke is going to stay with Paul now all the way to Rome. Verse 6 describes the arrival in Troas. It says we sailed from Philippi. So Luke and Paul sailed away from Philippi. You know, as we said before, Luke was previously left behind in Philippi in Acts 16 verse 40 as the pastor there. Now he's back in Philippi. Paul picked up Luke again, and this was after the days of unleavened bread that they left, which included the 11 days following the feast of Passover. And so this shows here that Paul had to observe Passover in Philippi because of the plot that we had back in verse 3. He knew he was going to make it in time to Jerusalem. And that's why Paul also didn't leave for Troas with the others, and neither did Luke. They stayed there to celebrate Passover in Philippi. And this may also imply that Luke was a Jew. For that reason, Luke may also have remained with Paul during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, Paul was now trying to reach Jerusalem by the Feast of Pentecost, which is the next feast, according to Acts chapter 20, verse 16. And the trip from Philippi to Troas takes 5 days. It's about 150 miles, and it takes 5 days to sail across there. And then we see it took and came onto them. Who is it them? They're the other 5 guys who had sailed earlier to Troas. They're in Troas, and then they stayed there 7 days. Again, Luke's now with them. After rising in Troas, there's 7 days there. And we see in 2 Corinthians 2, 12 to 13, when he came to Troas earlier, he had an open door to present the gospel. But however, his agony of the Corinthian church made him move on to Macedonia. And now he remained a week in Troas. He says a longer time to perhaps make up for, he only spent a shorter period there earlier on. Okay. In verse 7 to 12, we introduce to this guy Eutychus. We have the meeting of the church. So it's upon the first day of the week. Remember, Sunday is never referred to as the Lord's Day. It is always referred to as the first day of the week. And the context of these verses shows us that it was nighttime. And in Jewish reckoning, remember, the evening of the first day of the week is Saturday night. It's after 6 p.m. Saturday. So this shows that the early church did not meet on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock like we do. Early church met Saturday night. What they'd usually do is they would gather together after Shabbat. So by Sunday and Saturday, it was already the first day of the week, according to the Jewish reckoning of time. They gathered together. What purpose? They gathered together now to break bread. So this was a formal meeting as the Greek word implies here. So they gathered together for the purpose of breaking bread. And the Greek word used here it's for the regular gathering of believers. Came for the purpose of breaking bread, and this was a communion, which probably followed, the agape feast, the love feast. Now, Paul discoursed with them. What did he do? He preached a sermon, and this is which means the way it's written in the Greek, it meant that he went on preaching a sermon. He went on for a long time. And now we can see what happened with Eutychus. Paul's intent was to depart on the next day, which would have been our Sunday morning, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. So he went. The Greek means he went on and on and on until midnight. It's a very long sermon, and in verse 8 we have the surroundings being described here. And there were many lights in the upper chamber where we were gathered together. And the lights were not electric lights, they were oil lamps, right? So they had, Saturday night, these lamps were oil lamps with wicks. And you imagine all these lights that they're burning away, the air would be filled with, smoke and whatnot up in this upper chamber. Upper chamber is a large room where you could have large meetings conducted. So all the lamps up there are burning away, the air now becomes a bit stifled, which would cause a person to become a little bit drowsy, especially if Paul is going on and on and on. And in verse 9, we see the death of Eutychus. This young man, he's sitting in a window, and in actual fact, the name Eutychus, what does it mean? It means fortunate. So, young fortunate is sitting in the window. Or a little door, the Greek means a little door. It's like a latticed window with no glass in it. It was open simply because of the many lamps, and suddenly Eutychus found himself overcome by sleep, which means that the Greek, the way it's written is, it means it was a gradual process of going into deep sleep. Sometimes you'll be at the football and you get really tired at the football and you start to nod off, you're nod off. And that's what happens. I know you don't get tired at the football, but you might get tired in a meeting and your head tends to drop. Your head could be dropping right now. And so this is what was happening to Eutychus. And he was borne down by his sleep and he fell down from the 3rd story. As Paul goes on and on, Eutychus struggled to stay awake and finally fell asleep. And when he fell asleep, he lost control of himself and he fell down from the 3rd story. The upper chamber here was in the 3rd story. So he falls down, he kills himself. And we're told he was taken up dead. And remember, Luke is there, Dr. Luke is there. And Luke, medical doctor, he's there and he says, yep, this young man's dead. But in verse 10, we now have the resurrection of Eutychus. And Paul now goes down and fell on him. Paul went down from the 3rd floor to the ground floor and fell upon him. And this was the process by which he'd bring him back to life. Very similar to 2 other Old Testament prophets, Elijah and Elisha. Elijah back in 1 Kings 17:21 and Elisha in 2 Kings 4:32-37. Paul then embraced him. He hung around him. And Paul says, make no ado, he's all right. Stop making a noise. His life is in him. And Paul hops back up, goes back up to the 3rd story, and now continues preaching some more. And when he was gone up and had broken the bread and eaten, so they broke bread or had communion, and talked with them a long while. He continued his sermon at great length until he was finished. And when did he finish? Daybreak. It was when the sun was coming up. This was actually would have been his 2nd sermon, which lasted even longer than the 1st sermon. 1st sermon lasted until midnight. 2nd sermon lasted after eating from midnight until dawn. And that's when he left. He leaves after saying all that he wanted to say. And in verse 12, what we see here, it now describes the state of Eutychus. And they brought the lad alive. So earlier he'd been taken up dead, now he was taken up alive, and they were not a little comforted. They were pretty happy. You know, we had a dead man at our meeting, oh, but he was resurrected back to life. So Eutychus, the fortunate young man, was taken home alive. Now we go to Miletus. Are we going for time? We're going, verse 13. But we going before to the ship set sail for Ephesus, there intending to take in Paul, for so had he appointed, intending himself to go by land. And when he met us at Ephesus, we took him in and came to Mytilene. And sailing from thence, we came the following day over against Troas, and the next day we touched at Samos, and the day after we came to Miletus. For Paul had determined to sail past Ephesus, that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. And from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called to him the elders of the church. So he goes from Troas, the first leg of the trip from Troas to Ephesus, but the guys went by ship. So what we see here, it says, we going before the ship, the we included Luke, Paul's party, including Luke, went ahead of him and sailed for Ephesus. It's 20 miles between Troas and Ephesus. Ephesus was a seaport just south of Troas in Mysia, province of Asia. And there he writes that we're going to take Paul on board the ship because Paul had chosen to go overland. He chose to walk. He's going to pick up the ship in Ephesus. And so that's what we see happens here. He goes by foot. You know, it was only a 20-mile walk over good paved Roman roads, so it wasn't a problem. And in verse 14, we have the second leg of the trip from Ephesus to Mytilene. When he met us at Ephesus, you know, when they'd come together again. Then we took him in, got Paul on board the ship, and then we came to Mytilene. Mytilene was the capital of Lesbos. It's another 30 miles from Assos. And then verse 15, they go from Mytilene to Miletus. So they come the following day against Chios, which is down there in Mytilene. Chios was an island in the Aegean Sea. It was only 8 miles from the mainland. Second leg was the next day we touched at Samos. So they're going island hopping, one-day trips, you know, seeing the scenery. And they come down to Samos. And by sailing from Chios to Samos, they bypassed Ephesus because Paul wanted to get to Jerusalem. He didn't want to have to stop in Ephesus. Didn't want to waste time in Ephesus. And then the day after, they now come to Miletus, another day trip. This is the southernmost Greek city of the province of Asia. And so we see down there, down there in, it was one of the Ionian Greek cities. It was the city of the Ionian Greeks. And by Paul's day, it had already been eclipsed by Ephesus. And archaeology, they found an inscription in a pagan theatre that read, "The place of the Jews who are also God-fearing." So this shows that the Jews of Miletus became somewhat secularized down there. Verse 16 was, we see the reason for Paul's itinerary. Paul had determined to sail past Ephesus. He wanted to bypass Ephesus. This means he either had chartered the ship or that the captain of the ship was willing to oblige Paul. And the reason he didn't want to spend any time in Asia, because he was hurrying to get to Jerusalem. He wanted to sail past. He wanted to be in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. And if he had to spend time in Ephesus, he wouldn't have made his schedule. Now, Paul kept the Feast of Pentecost. Again, you know, this doesn't contradict his faith. He can voluntarily attend whatever feasts he wants to attend. In verse 17, from Miletus he now sent to Ephesus, and he called the elders of the church down to him in Miletus. You know, it's a 30-mile walk, a steady, long day's walk, and so he called the elders down to himself in Miletus. And the Greek word for elders here is the word presbyteros, from which we get the word Presbyterian, and these elders are the highest authorities in the local church. And they're also known, we're going to see next week, as bishops in verse 28. So elders and bishops were one and the same office. But Paul exercised his apostolic authority over the elders. So he called the elders down to meet him down there in Miletus, because he is the top dog. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson or teaching. There are contact details there. If you ever want to contact us through those things. There's contact details there. Let's